So welcome to another module in this course. In the last module, we added authentication. In this module, I will add authorization, and that's a slightly different thing. In the last lecture, we made sure that users interacting with our web page need to be authenticated, which means they need to have an account in order to be able to create posts, edit posts, or delete posts, and see these options in the first place. Now, authorization goes one step further. We don't want to allow every user to edit or delete every post. Users should instead be connected to the posts they created in the database. So we want to have a connection. We want to store the ID of a user who created a post. And then when a user tries to delete a post, we want to check that the user who did this really is the user who created the post. So that is what we will implement in this module, authorization, which is all about connecting users and posts. So let's connect users and posts. And it starts on our backend, in our model to be precise. I want to store the information about which user created which post in my database. And now we could either store a list of posts in our user object, or we store a list of users, or one user to be precise, on our post, because each post will only be created by one user. And that seems like the more reasonable approach, since we will be interested in finding out if the user ID of the user who is sending a request matches the user ID of a post. So let's go to our post model and edit it. Thus far, we store no user information here. Now, this is going to change. I'll add a new field here, which I'll name creator, because this is going to be information about who created this post. Now, the type of this field is not going to be a string, it's going to be a Mongoose object ID object, because it's going to be an ID. This, under the hood, will be a string stored in MongoDB, but Mongoose manages it as a separate type. We can access this type on Mongoose, and there we find the schema object, which has a static types object, where we then have object ID. So this is essentially what an ID will be treated as in Mongoose. We also want to require this, so require this set to true, and now I want to add one extra piece of information. Thus far, we're telling Mongoose that we're going to store an ID here, but I want to even tell Mongoose to which model this ID will relate. And therefore, I will add an extra property here, the ref property. The ref property allows us to define to which model this ID we are going to store here will belong. And that, of course, will be our user model, because we're going to store a user ID here, an ID belonging to a user which is stored in our database. So this is the idea here. We're going to add this extra piece of information. And this will, of course, be added automatically. The user is not going to enter this into the form where he creates the post. Instead, this is going to be inferred from that token, which we pass with requests reaching our backend. So let's save this. And now I quickly want to go back and, first of all, delete all the posts I have here. So let's quickly log in and clear them all so that we have an empty database, because I want to ensure that now that we're changing the type of data we're saving, all the data has the same format. This is technically not required by MongoDB, but I want to have a clean database for this application. So now with that, we are prepared. We cleared our database and we added this creator key to our data schema. Now in the next lecture, we can actually use that and store that information whenever a new post is created. With the updated Mongoose schema, let's go to our posts route, and there to the route where we actually create a new post. There we store the title, content, and image path. Now we want to populate that new creator field here too. Now for that, I'll add it here. And now the big question, of course, is where are we going to get the user ID from? We're not passing it as part of the request, but it will actually be part of our token. If we go to the user.js file in the routes folder, in the login route where we create that token, we actually encode the user ID into that token. And if you remember what I said about that token in the last module, I said that this token can be decoded. It's not encrypted. So we can fetch that user ID from the token. And that's exactly what I want to do. I can go back to my post route here, and I can decode the token here to get the information which is inside of it. But now that I say decode, if we have a look at our middleware, check off, we actually do already verify the token here. And the verification method, this verify method, actually retrieves the token for us. It gives us a decoded token. That means that we actually get back a result which we're not using yet, but this result will be the decoded token. So decoded token. Let me store that in a new constant. And now that means we can access the data which is inside of that token. So to be precise, the data which we are encoding into the token, the email and the user ID. And some standard fields which are always encoded into the token, but that is our custom data which we added. Now the problem just is, I don't need that data in the check-off method. I need it in my posts routes, for example, here in that route where we create a new post. Now the cool thing is, ExpressJS, the NodeJS framework we're using here, gives us the ability of easily adding new pieces of data, new fields to that request object. And if our middleware then calls next, the request is going to move on to the next middleware, and it's going to keep any fields we added to it. So what we can do here is we can simply access request and then add a new field. Just make sure to not overwrite one which already exists. For example, we could add user data here. That's a field which does not exist. But now I'm setting it equal to a new JavaScript object where I want to have my email, which I can get from the decoded token. There we're going to have an email property because in the user.js route file, we're going to add one here. And I can get my user ID field, which we're also passing into the token. So I can also add a second field here, which is going to be the user ID, which is decoded token user ID. And now with that, we're adding this to the request, which means every method, every middleware running after the check-off middleware will get that extra piece of information. And if we now have a look at our posts.js file, we see that our middleware here, where we try to create a new post, does run after the check-off middleware. So we will have that extra piece, that extra user data field available there. Now, with that information, we get everything we need, of course. Let's first of all verify that this really is the case. So I'll temporarily remove that creator field here, and I will actually return a new response here with status 200, JSON, an empty object, just so that the save method doesn't get executed and we don't store that post to the server, because now I really just want to console log request user data to prove that this is available, and I don't want to save anything to the database. So with that, let's save all the code, and let's go back and create a new post. And again, keep in mind, yeah, the image is going to get uploaded, but the post is not going to get saved. So here correctly, we don't add the post. But if we now look into our server-side terminal, we see that this is that user data object I was talking about. So it is available. With that, let's remove that return statement and the console log statement. And now let's add that creator field to our post object we're going to create here. And that creator will actually get the value we have here, request user data, user ID. So this value. And this is a string, but keep in mind, this will be taken by Mongoose and turned into this object ID object. So with that, we should be able to store the user ID as part of our post. We can prove this by saving this, but also editing another route here where we actually get all the posts. We do return all the posts, keep that in mind, and these posts should of course contain the user ID then. So if I go to the Angular code, into the posts service where we do fetch all the posts, then I can go into my subscribe method and simply console log the transformed post data. And this means that we should see the creator ID there too. And now with that, we're trying to log the post data we got. Now, one important thing to keep in mind, we're mapping the post data here, and we're actually mapping it into a new object where we don't use that creator ID anymore. So let's add a field here, and we will need this later too. So this is really important, not just for debugging now. So we'll add my creator field there and access post creator, because we should be getting that information from the server. And with that, we can go back to our Angular app, create a new post, test with some dummy content, and pick an image here, spring. If we now save this, we render the post, and if we have a look at the posts here into this array, we see that here we got a creator ID, which actually is the ID of the user who created this post. Now, this of course is one important step. Now we got that ID here. The next step, which we'll take in the next lectures, is to use that ID on the backend to deny any delete or update requests made by another user for a given post. So we added our connection between users and posts, and we're returning that data to the front end. Let's now go back to the backend and utilize this connection to deny requests for deleting or editing a post if they are made by a user who did not create that post. And for that, I'm in the posts.js file here, and there we have the router put method, and we get the router delete method, which I'm interested in protecting. Let's start with the update method, so the put route here. There, we want to make one simple thing, or want to do one simple thing. We want to ensure that only the user who created the post can edit it. This means that when we're looking for a post and when we want to update it with update 1, we actually want to ensure that this only happens for posts created by that user. One convenient way of doing this would be to simply add another argument to the condition we have here and check for the creator field, which should actually be equal to request user data user ID. Remember, we have that piece of information in our request. And this would only update a post which matches our post ID, but also the given creator ID. And it would therefore fail if we have the right post ID, but if we're not the creator of the post. Let me show this to you. If I save this and I go back, let me log out and log in with a different user. So not the user who created this. To log in again, I see that post and I can still click edit because we haven't done anything on the front end to prevent this. Now if I add exclamation marks and hit save post, we actually don't see the exclamation marks here. We actually also don't get an error, that's a problem, but indeed the updating failed. If I log back in with the user who did create the post, and I now edit this, and add one exclamation mark here, now the exclamation mark is there, because now both conditions were met, and they have to be met both to, well, succeed. But the problem is that we don't give back a meaningful error. Now let's check what result we're getting back if we do fail to update. For this, I'll again log out and switch my user, go back to the user who did not create that post, and try this again. Edit, and now let's go to the network tab and actually clear it, so that we see new outgoing network requests. And I'll add an extra exclamation mark, hit save post, and now we get 4 requests. These 2 requests fetched the posts when we were navigated. These 2 requests are related to updating. The second request is an additional options request, which is always sent back or sent by the browser to your backend. But this one is the actual put request we sent. And as you see, we got back update successful. Now we didn't get an error. We also saw that in the console. There is no error here. So we made it into the then block. Now, let's have a look at the result we got there. Maybe this gives us some idea about whether we did successfully update or not. So I added result here and saved. And now if we try to edit this again, still with the user who's not entitled to do so, we get the same result as before. But on the server, if we have a look at our server-side terminal here, and there we see this strange object. Now we see something which looks promising and modified, which seems to indicate how many entries were modified, how many results in the database. Let's validate this assumption by logging into the valid user who did create this, and then editing this post, which of course will succeed now. If we now go back and have a look at the server-side log again, we see that here we got a log where n modified is 1. So this seems to be an indicator which helps us determine whether we did successfully modify a post or not. And therefore, we can use this. We can check if result n modified is greater than 0, in which case we know we did indeed update the post. And so I will send my old response. Else, I will send a different response, a 401 status code, to indicate that the user is not authorized to perform this action. And here, I will send back not authorized as a message. If we now save this, and I do log into the user who is not authorized again, and now I try to edit this again, going to edit, adding an exclamation mark and saving this, now we get this error. And we're not handling it on the front end. This is something we'll have to do later, but we're getting the error. And that's a great enhancement of our app, actually, because this means that we are now saving this on the backend, and we're also returning a message about the success of this action to the frontend. Now let's add that same logic to the deletion route. There we use delete one, and we can use the exact same way of validating that the user who is trying to delete is the right user. We can add the creator check here in our condition and check request user data user ID. And this will therefore only delete that post if we got the right user ID for that post. This means that here I can also just copy that result handling I got in my update method. Here I'll just replace my old response with that. Here I will say deletion successful or not authorized in the other case. And now we updated this delete method too. Let's see if it works. Let's save this. Let's reload the Angular app to unbreak it. And I'm still logged in with the user who's not allowed to edit this and who's not allowed to delete this. So if I hit delete here, I also correctly get an error. And if we reload, the post still is there. If I log out and switch to the user who did create that post, I can, however, delete it successfully, or I should at least, but it still fails. So something's wrong here. Let's reload. Well, the post is not there. That succeeded, but we still got this message. So something seems to be different about the result we're getting here in the deletion case. So let's have a look at this now. For that, let's simply re-add a console log statement here, and let's see what the result is for a successful deletion. Here, if I now go to new post and quickly create a new post so that I can delete it, if I do that and then pick delete here, we get that error. And on the back end, in the terminal of the server, we see there simply is no modified field. And that makes sense. We're not modifying this result. We're deleting it, right? So we can just take the n value, which was also present for updating, by the way. So you could take it there too. Let's just take n here and check if that is greater than 0, because it seems to indicate whether this was successful or not. So now if we save this and I reload, the post of course is gone. Now let's add a new post real quick, and let's not immediately delete it. Instead, I'll first going to switch the user to see that it does fail for the other user, because this is not the user who created the post. There, if I click delete, I still get that error. And if I reload the app, the post still is there. And now if I switch to the user who did create that post, and I click delete, it does work without an error. So now we got the deletion in place too. We added server-side authorization. And that's super important because that actually is the part which can't be hacked easily. The Angular code is just JavaScript code running in the browser. It can be edited by the user if he really wants to. Therefore, Angular is always just used to provide a better user experience. If we're blocking the user from doing something there, we're just doing it to prevent something which will cause an error otherwise. But on the server side, we're doing the real protection. There, we really deny actions we don't want to happen. On the front end, in Angular, we just try to provide a better user experience. But still, we should try to do that. So in our app right now, every user can click delete, even users who are authenticated but did not create a post. So we should adjust our front-end code. In the post list component here, we actually show these buttons, edit and delete, to any user who is authenticated. Now that's not correct anymore. We want to restrict this a bit further. We only want to show these buttons to users who are authenticated and the creator of that post. Now that means we need to get that user ID to the front end first of all. So let's go to our server-side code. And in the user route here, in the login route, where we do return that token to the front end, I don't just want to return the token and the expiry, I also want to return the user ID. So here, user ID. And we can get that user ID simply from that fetched user ID, which we're also encoding in the token. And by the way, since it's encoded in the token and that token can be decoded, we actually wouldn't have to pass that as an extra field. It's already part of the token. But decoding the token will impact our performance on the front end, and it's really unnecessary, which is why I'm passing this as an extra field with the response so that we can easily parse it. So now we're passing the user ID to the front end whenever we are logging in. This means that we can now store this information on the front end in the auth folder, in the auth service, where we are sending that login request. There we are already storing the authentication status and the token. Now I will add a new property to our auth service, and that will be our user ID. Now the user ID will be a string. And if we had more information about the user, which we use here on the front end, we could of course also create a separate user object. So a model in our Angular code to hold that extra information, so that we combine ID, email, full name, whatever we might have in one model. But here I just have the user ID, so I'm going to stick to that. But you could create such a separate user model if you needed that for your application. Here it's the user ID I'm interested. So in the login function here, when we do get back the response and we know that we have a token, then I want to set this user ID equal to response user ID. And I need to update my TypeScript code here to tell it that this post request will indeed yield a response which has a token, which has the expires in field, and which now also has the user ID field, which will hold a string. So now we're extracting that user ID here and storing it in this user ID property of our service. This means that we can now use that user ID in our application. For that, I'll add a new method, getUserID, and there I will just return this user ID. Now I want to get that user ID from my post list component, of course, because there I need to compare it against the ID of the post we're looking at. So in that post list component here, I will add a user ID field, which initially is undefined but of type string, so let's define the type here. And then in constructor, we're already injecting the auth service. So in ng-on-init, I can fetch that user ID. So here I will say this user ID equals this auth service get user ID. Now I also want to fetch the updated user ID in case the authentication did change. So that means I will also set user ID in the listener to my auth status change here. So there where I reset the user is authenticated status, I will also fetch the current user ID. That means that I want to fetch null or undefined here if the user is switching from authenticated to unauthenticated, so if the user is logging out. Therefore, in the auth service, I have to reset the user ID field here whenever we are logging out. So here in logout, I will actually set this user ID equal to null. This is important to ensure that this is reset correctly. Additionally, we also got our auto-auth user method here, where we assign the user in based on data we have stored in local storage. Now, we're not storing the user ID in local storage yet, but we need to do this, of course, because we need that information in the future too. So in save-auth data, I expect to get one extra field, which is the user ID, which is of type string. And then I will simply call local storage set item user ID and store that user ID we're getting as an argument. In clear auth data, I of course want to delete that field now with remove item user ID. And in get auth data, well, there I want to return it. So here I will get my user ID, reach out to the local storage, and call get item user ID to retrieve that from the local storage. We now just have to add it to the object which we return here. So there I will add my user ID field where I store that user ID fetched from the local storage. So now we're getting that data, we're saving it. In my auth auto user field here, where I'm fetching the auth information, this just means that if we have a valid token down there, I also should initialize this user ID with my auth information user ID. So with the user ID fetched from the local storage. So now we're also saving this. There's just one more thing we have to do. We're now expecting user ID as an argument on save auth data. That means that here, where we are calling this, I should store this piece of information, of course. So there I will indeed store this user ID. So the user ID which I set here from the response. So now the user ID should be managed correctly. In the next lecture, we'll use it together with the creator ID attached to a post to successfully manipulate the buttons we can click on a post. So we're handling the user ID now. Now let's use it in the post list component. There we are already setting the user ID. Now we can use it in conjunction with the creator information we have on every post. Keep in mind, in the posts service, we are extracting that creator from the response we're getting back from the server. We're storing it in the posts, which we handle in the post service. So this should work. Therefore, in the post list component, every post which we render onto the screen should have that creator ID in it. And we also got the user ID. So now if we go to the template, we should be able to add an extra condition to this ngIf statement. I want to show these buttons if the user is authenticated and if my user ID, keep in mind, that is this property here, if my user ID is equal to the post creator field. Whoops, creator written like that. Now it's creator because in my post service, I'm adding this field here. You see that we get an error in the template though. And that error is stemming from the case that our post model, which we're using, doesn't have that creator field. So let's add it here. I'll add this creator field, which also is a string. I guess it's a pretty boring model. Everything is a string, but that's not that uncommon actually. So now we have the creator field here too. In the post service, we now have an error down there where we actually update a post because there we're not sending that creator ID. And that's important, of course. When we update a post, we want to keep that creator ID. Now, actually, I will just set creator here to null. Now, we could definitely take the ID of the user who is currently logged in, but that would open the window for the user to manipulate that. And I don't want that. So instead, I want to handle this on the server. If we go back to the server, to my posts.js routes, when we update a post here in the put route, I of course want to add the creator field again. but I will take that from the user data we have in the request and there from the user ID, just as we do it when we create a post up there. So I want to handle this on the server side so that this can't be faked on the client side. We're still now fulfilling all the post model requirements in the post service. And in the post list component, this means that the error now is gone. So now we're checking for that equality. I'm getting an error here though in the post create component. There we indeed have, of course, a post which we are trying to load when we are editing a post. And there we are simply missing that creator field. So let's add creator here, post data creator. This is failing because in my post service, where we are getting that single post here with get post, I'm not adding it, or I'm not specifying that extra field which will be returned by the server. So let's add it here. Creator, which is a string, will now also be part of the response object we're getting. And now with that, we got that creator field added here because we know it will be part of the response we're getting back when fetching a post. And with that, our app should be working. Now if we go back, and I'm logged in, and I create a new post, I can hit save post, of course, and I should be able to see edit and delete here. And I'm not. Now let's switch user real quick. If I log in with a different user, then I also don't see it. Well, that's correct at least. But of course we should see it if we log in with the creator of that post. Now I see it, but I didn't see it right after I created a post. Let's check this again. If I try this again, create another new post, here we got it, and here we got it too. So it might have just been a reload problem. Again, let's switch the account to the user who did not create that post. There, the edit and delete buttons are missing. But if we create a new post here, let's see if we see the edit and delete button for that then on the next page. There we have them, edit and delete. If I go back to the previous page, there they are missing. So now our front-end check is working too. Always keep in mind, this is not really a security mechanism. This is really just to provide a better user experience and protect the user from running into errors where we know they would happen.